we did acquire greater intelligence as the brain went up incrementally in size.
If you follow the debate on race and intelligence, you're probably familiar with some of the claims that the race deniers make about the relationship between brain size and intelligence. To recap, the race deniers will claim, or have in the past claimed, that there really are no reliable measures of brain sizes among human populations, and that claim has been thoroughly debunked by many sources, including even the New York Times, which recently exposed Stephen Jay Gould, author of The Mismeasure of Man, as a fraud. So there's really no basis in science for denying that there are variations in brain sizes. And HannibalBarca13 has even in the past shown us images from his own textbook showing the various distinguishing features of the skulls of Mongoloids, Caucasoids, and Negroids. The other claim that the race deniers make about the relationship between brain size and intelligence is that even if there are differences in sizes, size doesn't necessarily correlate to intelligence. And then they'll go on to claim that, well, what is intelligence? We can't rely on IQ scores. We can't rely on all the data we've accumulated painstakingly over all these decades on the various ways of measuring human intellectual aptitude. We can't figure out a single thing among any of these measures that would give us insight into the term intelligence. So they'll play dumb and pretend not to have any idea of what intelligence is or how to measure it. So keep these 2 points in mind, that brain size, according to the race deniers, has no definite relationship to intelligence, and we don't know what intelligence is. Keep those 2 claims in mind as you watch this clip from Hannibal Barca.
Talk about this higher intelligence, and I really don't think that's the way it should be seen. We didn't incrementally acquire a bigger brain, more intelligence. No.
We did not incrementally acquire a bigger brain and more intelligence. Then why is it that with Ardipithecus ramidus you have a brain of about 350 cc's, and by the time you get to Homo sapiens sapien it's up to 1500? This incremental, non-existent incremental increase in human brain size occurs over the span of that time of evolution. Up until Ardipithecus ramidus, well actually even later than that, up until we see Australopithecus afarensis, actually, human brain size had flatlined. And it's only after A. afarensis that we start to see the increase in the human brain, going slowly up from about 300 to 600, then up to 600 to 1,000. Incremental steps. Hoocha, 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 lobster.
Okay, well, I don't know what those noises followed by lobster means, but in the preceding remarks, Hannibal Barca seems to very confidently claim that brain size over hundreds of thousands, millions of years ago varied, and he seems to know precisely to what extent and in what periods it did, and he just assumes that it's linked to intelligence. And yet, for more recent human development, as human beings branched off into separate geographically isolated populations that developed their own heritable phenotypes that extended to skull shape and brain size, Hannibal Barca plays dumb. So Hannibal Barca just confidently infers about an early hominid that was around more than 4 million years ago, based solely on fossil finds. He just infers that they correlate to brain size, which he just infers correlate to intelligence. Now, I would argue that that is a valid inference. It is an inference that he refuses to make with regard to modern Homo sapiens and the varieties that they come in. This despite the fact that we don't have to rely merely on fossils. We can actually take measurements of the actual brain, the organ itself. Moreover, we can measure the way that the brains perform. If you don't like IQ tests, there are plenty of other tests. There are plenty of other ways of measuring mental aptitude. But HannibalBarca takes all these tools that we have to gain knowledge about the way that the human species has evolved and branched off, and he says that they're now all worthless, that all this knowledge makes drawing valid conclusions more difficult than it would be that if all we had to rely on were fossils. Okay, so HannibalBarca, for all those race deniers out there who insist that there is no particular relationship between brain size and intelligence, please set the record straight.
We did acquire greater intelligence as the brain went up incrementally in size.
Thank you very much.
Due in part to, as I tried to describe, selective pressure,
And these selective pressures would have been different for human populations that existed in Africa versus those that migrated into Asia, into Europe, into other parts of the globe, and faced particular adaptive pressures in those respective environments that produced particular traits that were heritable, that resulted in what we call human races.
mostly in a social setting.
Social setting. Well, yeah, sex and reproduction is a social activity. But apart from that, what are you saying? That brain size increase was a social construct? When did our early hominid ancestors acquire the ability to make social constructs? Or do all species do social constructs? I'm not clear on what you mean by social.
And this is very recent information, and I can't fault the guy for making the statement, because the recent information I'm talking about, which will be linked in the low bar, has just come out a week ago.
So the gist of this is that people with large social networks can actually trigger the development and growth of certain structures of their brains. Now, this is interesting. So, as far as this relates to the debate on race and brain size, then let's take a sample of blacks with large social networks and whites and Asians and compare their brain sizes, and then take a sample of each of the three groups with relatively small social networks and compare their brain sizes. Now, I suspect we'll get the same results as we'll get with any other environmental variable, whether it's a social network or it's poverty or it's nutrition. You'll find that any one of these things, yes, it has some impact on intelligence, maybe even the actual physiological features of the brain, but they don't change the differences that are inherited, and they only build upon those differences that are given by nature. And so if you expose people with different hereditary backgrounds to the same social stimuli, then you will still observe the differences that are caused by genetics. When it comes to measuring intelligence averages of populations within the human species, HannibalBarca proclaims a hyperskepticism that prevents him from being able to know whether a population with an average IQ score of 70 is any more or less intelligent than a population with an average IQ score of 105. It's not just because HannibalBarca insists that IQ scores don't really measure intelligence. It's because he doesn't believe that intelligence can even be defined, at least when it comes to measuring modern-day humans and the different populations that they branched off into. And yet, isn't it interesting that Hannibal Barca seems perfectly capable of making broad judgments upon other people's intellect with whom he debates. He calls Gary an idiot. He's called libertarian realist a fool about 22 times. And he's called fringe elements the dumbest of us all. So Hannibal Barca uses objective terminology relating to an assessment of a person's intellect to describe a person who happens to disagree with Hannibal Barca. You will not discover the truth about human racial differences if you are wearing an ideological hat as part of your inquiry. Whether it's radical egalitarianism, radical individualism, fundamentalist objectivism, Christianity, Nazism, or allegiance to what is considered socially acceptable and politically correct. Regardless of the ideological or ethical pressures, they are irrelevant to the ascertainment of knowledge about how humans developed, how they branched off, and how they evolved particular traits and phenotypes after they branched off. It's simply a matter of looking at the evidence. And people with a background in science, if they were studying any other species, just going by the fossil record, they would draw the conclusions that the race realists draw. But they make an exception for the study of human beings, and the only plausible explanation for this exception is ideological bias.